I was loading a shipment schedule at work when my phone started buzzing so fast that I thought someone in my family had died. Instead, I saw a message from a coworker that simply read, "Evan, is this really about you?" Under it was a link to a regional podcast that I had never listened to before. My stomach tightened before I even pressed play. The title mentioned, "The most ungrateful son we've ever met." I almost closed it, but then I heard my mother's voice, calm, friendly, confident. "Our son, Evan Collins." She said my full name without hesitation. Then my father laughed into the microphone. "We've tried everything. He's impossible." The host laughed with them. They spent nearly an hour talking about me as if I weren't a real person. According to them, I couldn't keep a job, couldn't pay my own bills, couldn't live alone, refused treatment for serious mental problems, and blamed everyone else for my failures. Every few minutes my mother sighed dramatically and thanked their church friends for never giving up on our poor boy. My father joked that they were surprised I hadn't managed to burn their house down while trying to make toast. Everyone in the studio laughed. I didn't. I couldn't even breathe properly. I sat frozen in the break room while their voices filled my headphones. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was how believable they sounded. They had rehearsed this story for years. Every sentence flowed naturally. Every detail supported the next one. They spoke with the confidence of people who had told the same lie so many times that even they had started believing it. My manager knocked on the door and asked if I was feeling all right. I pulled my headphones off so quickly that one of them hit the floor. "Yeah," I lied. "Just a family thing." He nodded and walked away. I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't force the words out. By the end of the afternoon, half the office had already heard about the podcast. Nobody confronted me directly, but I noticed conversations stopping whenever I entered the room. Two drivers who normally joked with me suddenly became awkwardly polite. One dispatcher asked if I needed someone to drive me home. Another quietly offered information about counseling services. They were trying to be kind, but every gesture reminded me that strangers now believed they knew the worst version of me. That evening, I drove back to my house in Billings with the radio turned off. The silence felt safer than hearing another familiar voice. I had lived there for almost 18 months. It wasn't a large house. The living room still needed paint, and the garage was full of unopened boxes because I kept choosing overtime instead of decorating. But every mortgage payment came from my paycheck. Every bill carried only my name. I had earned a promotion to logistics coordinator 4 months earlier after working weekends for nearly 2 years. None of that existed inside the story my parents had just told thousands of listeners. According to them, I still lived in my childhood bedroom and depended on them for everything. The strange part was that they honestly didn't know where I lived. I had moved quietly after years of arguments because I finally realized that every piece of information I shared eventually became another weapon. If they knew I bought a car, they told relatives I wasted money. If they heard I worked overtime, they claimed my boss forced me because I was unreliable. If I stayed silent, at least they had fewer facts to twist. My fiancée, Rachel, arrived an hour later. She didn't hug me when I opened the door. She simply held up her phone. "Your mom has been getting hundreds of supportive comments," she said softly. "My aunt sent me the episode before I even saw your text." I stepped aside and let her in. She walked slowly through the house as if she had never been there before, although she had visited dozens of times. Finally, she looked at me. "Tell me none of it's true." I almost laughed because the question sounded impossible. Instead, I opened a kitchen drawer and placed my mortgage statements, utility bills, tax documents, and promotion letter across the table. "I've never hidden anything from you," I said. "I've hidden my address from them." She looked through the papers without speaking. For a few seconds, I believed the documents would settle everything. Then she whispered, "Why would your own parents invent something like this?" I had no answer, not one that sounded reasonable. People expect parents to exaggerate their children's successes, not manufacture failures. Rachel rubbed her forehead. "Maybe they're confused. Maybe they honestly think they're helping. I shook my head. Nobody accidentally says someone can't hold a job while they're describing the exact period when he got promoted. She stayed another 20 minutes. We barely spoke. Before leaving, she kissed my cheek instead of my lips. "I just need a little time to think," she said. I watched her car disappear down the street, and I knew something important had already started slipping away. Around midnight, my phone rang. My older brother Liam. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, then again. On the fourth attempt, he finally left a message. "Come on, Evan. Don't be so dramatic. Mom's getting tons of attention. The podcast is blowing up. People know it's mostly entertainment. Stop acting like your life is over." I listened to it 3 times because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't apologizing. They were celebrating. The next morning, I searched my own name online. The podcast clip had already been copied onto multiple social media pages. People who had never met me debated whether I deserved sympathy or criticism. Complete strangers analyzed my personality based on stories that never happened. Then I noticed something else. The official podcast page proudly thanked my parents for allowing us to share Evan's inspiring family journey. I stared at that sentence for a long time because I had never agreed to any interview, any recording, or even the use of my name. That single line changed everything in my mind. Until then, I thought I was dealing with another cruel family humiliation. Now I realized there was something much bigger hiding underneath it, and I suddenly knew my next step could decide the rest of my life. The first thing I did that morning was call the podcast office instead of calling my parents. I knew exactly how every conversation with my family would end. They would interrupt me, accuse me of overreacting, remind me of everything they had supposedly sacrificed, and somehow convince themselves they were the real victims. Facts had never mattered inside our house, only the version of the story they wanted everyone else to believe. I refused to play that game again. The woman who answered the phone sounded cheerful until I introduced myself. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. "You're Evan Collins?" she finally asked. "Yes." "Could you hold for just a moment?" I waited nearly 10 minutes before another voice came on the line. This one belonged to the show's producer. He sounded polite, but careful. I explained that I had never agreed to participate in the episode, never signed a release, never gave permission for my full name to be broadcast, and certainly never approved the claims my parents had made about me. He interrupted only once. "Mr. Collins, according to our records, your mother confirmed that you had consented." I closed my eyes for a second. "Then your records are wrong." He immediately asked whether I could send that statement in writing. I said I would. Before hanging up, he promised they would review everything internally. His voice remained professional, but I noticed one small change. He no longer sounded confident. As soon as the call ended, I began saving everything. I downloaded the full episode before it could disappear. I copied every social media post. I took screenshots of comments that repeated specific false claims. I saved Liam's voicemail. I backed everything up twice, once on my laptop and once on an external drive. Years earlier, I probably would have started arguing with relatives one by one. Now, I wanted a complete record before anyone had the chance to rewrite history. By lunchtime, my phone had filled with messages. Most came from cousins, old classmates, or distant relatives I barely spoke to anymore. Almost every conversation followed the same pattern. "We're praying for you. Your parents have been through so much. Please let them help you." Nobody asked whether the podcast had been truthful. They already believed it. The strange thing was that several people mentioned details that had never appeared in the episode. One cousin wrote, "I'm glad your medication is finally working. I had never taken psychiatric medication in my life." Another relative asked whether I was still living in my parents' basement. Someone from church offered to help me prepare for future job interviews because my father had apparently told everyone I had been unemployed for years. Every message revealed another lie I had never heard before. That afternoon, I opened a spreadsheet and began writing down every false claim, who repeated it, and where it seemed to have originated. At first, I thought I was simply organizing information. After several hours, a disturbing pattern emerged. Different groups had received completely different versions of my life. Neighbors believed I had gambling problems. Church members believed I suffered from severe psychological instability. My mother's friends believed I couldn't cook or clean without supervision. My father's co-workers believed I had been fired from multiple jobs because I couldn't follow instructions. Rachel's family had apparently been told that I struggled with uncontrollable anger and isolated myself from everyone. None of those stories matched each other, but every version ended the same way. My parents had become the patient, exhausted heroes caring for their troubled son. The more I looked, the clearer the picture became. They had customized my fictional life depending on the audience. I wasn't one false story. I was dozens of carefully designed stories serving different purposes. Late that evening, Rachel came back. She looked tired. She sat across from me without saying a word while I showed her the spreadsheet. I expected disbelief. Instead, she slowly covered her mouth with one hand. "My parents," she whispered. "What?" She stared at one line for several seconds before answering. "Last year, your mom told mine that you were afraid of getting married because you couldn't function without her guidance. She said she hoped I'd be patient with your condition." I felt something inside me go completely still. Why didn't anyone tell me? Rachel looked ashamed. "Because we thought she was protecting your privacy. She cried while she said it. She begged my parents not to embarrass you by bringing it up." For the first time since the podcast aired, I realized this hadn't started recently. This had been happening for years while I believed I was simply drifting away from relatives for ordinary reasons. They weren't pulling away from me. They had been carefully pushed. Rachel reached across the table and held my hand. "I should have trusted you immediately," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." I squeezed her hand, but didn't answer. An apology couldn't erase what had already happened between us. The engagement still felt fragile, balanced on facts that neither of us fully understood yet. Before leaving, she asked one question that stayed with me all night. If they've lied to everyone for this long, what were they getting out of it? I didn't know then, but the answer arrived less than 24 hours later. The following afternoon, an elderly woman from my parents' church called me. I recognized her immediately. Mrs. Howard had known me since I was a child. We hadn't spoken in almost 4 years. Her voice trembled. "Evan," she said gently, "I don't think I was supposed to find your number." "It's all right." I watched that podcast. Something didn't feel right. Then I remembered seeing your promotion announcement on LinkedIn several months ago. My heart skipped. "You saw that?" "Yes. I almost called your mother because I was happy for you. Then I thought perhaps you wanted privacy." She hesitated before continuing. "Can I ask you something? Are you actually supporting yourself?" I looked around my quiet kitchen. My work boots were by the door. Mortgage papers still lay across the table. Utility bills waited to be paid. Everything in the room represented years of work that almost nobody in my own family admitted existed. "Yes," I answered. "I've been supporting myself for a long time." Mrs. Howard began crying. Not loudly, just enough that I could hear her trying to breathe normally again. When she finally spoke, her next sentence changed the direction of everything. "Evan, people at church have been collecting money for you for years. Your mother always said you couldn't survive on your own. I thought you knew." I stood there unable to move, realizing that the podcast might not have exposed my parents' biggest lie after all. It may have accidentally uncovered the one secret they had never expected anyone to question. Mrs. Howard apologized 3 different times before she finished explaining what she knew. She sounded embarrassed, as though she had done something wrong by believing my parents. I kept telling her she had nothing to apologize for. They were the ones who had earned people's trust, not her. She finally calmed down enough to tell me how it had started. About 5 years earlier, my mother had asked the church to pray for me because I was supposedly struggling to live independently. A few months later, she quietly mentioned that I had lost another job and needed help with groceries. Someone offered a gift card, then another family donated a used refrigerator. Before long, people began dropping off food, blankets, clothing, small appliances, and cash. According to my mother, every donation helped her keep Evan safe while he worked through another difficult season. Mrs. Howard admitted she had personally contributed several times. "I thought I was helping you," she whispered. "I never imagined—" She couldn't finish the sentence. I thanked her for telling me the truth and asked whether anyone else might know more. She hesitated before giving me the names of 3 church members who had helped organize seasonal charity drives. "Please don't mention my name unless you have to," she said. "People are going to be devastated if this isn't true." After we hung up, I sat staring at the wall for nearly half an hour. My parents had always liked attention. My mother loved being praised for her generosity. My father enjoyed being seen as the patient, long-suffering parent who never gave up. But I had never connected those personality traits to money. I still wanted to believe there had to be some misunderstanding. Maybe the donations had been intended for the whole family. Maybe people had simply assumed more than my parents actually said. I needed evidence, not assumptions. That evening, I contacted the 3 church members Mrs. Howard had mentioned. 2 responded the same night. Neither of them knew the other had already spoken to me. That mattered because their stories matched almost perfectly. One woman forwarded copies of church newsletters requesting support for a local family caring for an adult son facing ongoing personal challenges. My name wasn't printed there, but my mother had apparently spoken openly during meetings about who the requests concerned. Another volunteer searched through old email folders and found announcements about meal deliveries, fundraising breakfasts, and holiday collections. My mother's name appeared as the contact person every single time. By midnight, I had a folder containing years of emails, event flyers, volunteer schedules, and donation records. None of them proved fraud by themselves. What they proved was something equally important. My parents had repeatedly presented me as someone completely unable to support himself. Every document described the same fictional life that had been repeated on the podcast. The lies weren't random. They formed one consistent public image. Around 10 the next morning, my phone rang again. This time, it was Liam. I almost ignored him, but curiosity won. "Finally," he said before I could speak. "Mom's freaking out because you contacted the podcast." "How do you know that?" "She told me." "Why are you making this such a huge deal?" "Because they lied about me to thousands of people." He laughed quietly. "Nobody takes podcasts that seriously." "Your mother apparently does." The laughter stopped. "Don't start acting like you're better than everyone else just because you bought a little house." I froze. I had never told Liam about my house. I had deliberately kept my address from the entire family. "Who told you I bought a house?" There was a long pause. "People talk." "No," I replied. "Someone specific told you." He changed the subject immediately. "Listen, just delete whatever complaints you've sent. Mom says the producers are getting nervous." "Good. You're going to destroy this family." I looked around my quiet office before answering. "I didn't put my own name on a podcast." He hung up without another word. That conversation bothered me for reasons I couldn't explain. If my parents truly believed I was unemployed and dependent on them, how did Liam know about my mortgage? Someone had been quietly keeping track of my life while publicly pretending the opposite. I couldn't shake that thought. 2 days later, the podcast producer called back. His tone had changed completely. He thanked me for the written statement I had emailed and informed me that they had opened a formal internal review. Then he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mr. Collins, have your parents ever signed any documentation on your behalf?" "Not legally." "We're trying to understand how your consent was confirmed." I asked what he meant. He explained that their records showed a written declaration stating I had approved the discussion of my personal history. The signature wasn't mine. They wouldn't send me a copy yet because the review was ongoing, but they confirmed one detail that made my hands shake. The document had been submitted only 2 days before the recording. Someone had knowingly assured the production team that I had given permission. We're also reviewing several factual statements made during the episode, the producer added. Certain concerns have been raised internally. I thanked him and ended the call. Less than 5 minutes later, Rachel arrived unexpectedly at my office. She looked pale. "My parents want to talk to us tonight," she said. "About what?" She handed me her phone. A message from her father filled the screen. "We need to discuss something your mother never wanted to tell you before the wedding. It concerns conversations we've had with Evan's parents over the last 3 years. I read it twice. 3 years. My parents had been shaping my relationship long before I proposed. That evening, we drove to Rachel's parents' house together. Her father greeted us politely but looked uncomfortable. After everyone sat down, he disappeared into another room and returned carrying a worn accordion folder secured with a rubber band. "I wasn't sure whether I should ever show you this," he admitted. He removed several handwritten notes, greeting cards, and printed emails. "Your mother asked us to keep records in case your condition became worse after marriage." Rachel looked at him in disbelief. "Condition?" Her father nodded sadly. "She said Evan had periods where he couldn't tell reality from imagination. She wanted us to understand what we might face." I stared at the papers spread across the dining table. My mother hadn't just been telling stories. She had been building files, creating documentation, encouraging other people to preserve a fictional history about my life. And as Rachel's father quietly reached for one sealed envelope he had never opened before, I realized there might be something inside that my parents had never intended anyone else to read. Rachel, quote, S. Father, placed the sealed envelope in front of me but didn't touch it again. "Your mother gave this to us about 6 months before your engagement party," he said. "She told us not to open it unless there was some kind of emergency after the wedding." Rachel looked from the envelope to her parents. "Why didn't you tell us?" Her mother answered first. "Because we believed we were respecting your privacy." She cried while she handed it to us. She said she was terrified you would stop taking treatment and that she wanted us to be prepared if something happened. The room became completely silent. I slowly broke the seal. Inside was a typed letter with no official letterhead, no doctor's signature, and no medical records. It looked convincing at first glance because it used formal language, but after reading only a few paragraphs I realized it was simply a collection of accusations disguised as concern. According to the letter, I frequently imagined events that never happened, misunderstood other people's intentions, became financially irresponsible without warning, and often blamed family members for problems I had created myself. The final page urged Rachel's parents to contact my mother immediately if I ever claimed my family had lied about me, because that would supposedly be a predictable stage of his condition. I put the pages back on the table without speaking. Rachel picked them up and read them herself. Halfway through the second page, she quietly pushed the chair back and walked into the kitchen. I heard a cabinet door close harder than necessary. A minute later, she returned carrying a glass of water she never drank. She sat beside me, took my hand, and looked directly at her parents. "None of this is true," she said. Her father nodded slowly. "We're beginning to understand that." Then he reached into the folder again. "There's something else." This time he handed me copies of text messages between him and my mother. At first they seemed ordinary. Then one exchange caught my attention. My mother had written, "Please don't mention Evan's promotion if he tells you about it. Agree with him politely, but don't encourage unrealistic expectations." Rachel's father had replied, "Are you saying he wasn't promoted?" My mother's answer came minutes later. "He believes he was. It's complicated. We don't want to embarrass him." I felt a chill run through me. I wasn't reading exaggerations anymore. I was reading deliberate instructions designed to make truthful statements sound like delusions. Every real achievement I made could instantly be dismissed because my parents had already prepared people to doubt me. They hadn't merely spread lies, they had built a system where the truth itself would look suspicious. Rachel's father leaned back in his chair. "I checked your LinkedIn profile yesterday after we spoke. Your promotion was announced by your company. There were photographs from the ceremony. Your manager commented on the post. It wasn't something you imagined." I smiled faintly for the first time in days, but it disappeared almost immediately. How many other people received letters like this? Nobody answered because none of us knew. On the drive home, Rachel barely spoke. Just before we reached my house, she finally broke the silence. I almost believed them. She stared through the windshield instead of looking at me. Not completely, but enough to hesitate. Enough to make you feel alone. I nodded. That's exactly what they wanted. She turned toward me with tears in her eyes. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want you to know I'm done giving them the benefit of the doubt." For the first time since the podcast aired, I believed we still had a chance. The next morning, I organized everything into a timeline: podcast recording, church fundraising emails, donation announcements, Rachel's family's documents, LinkedIn evidence, mortgage records, employment history, bank statements showing my income over several years. I stopped thinking like a hurt son and started thinking like a logistics coordinator. Dates mattered. Documents mattered. Every claim had to connect to verifiable facts. Every contradiction needed to be easy for someone else to understand. By the end of the weekend, my dining table looked like a small investigation office. Colored tabs marked important events. Digital copies sat in clearly labeled folders. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. I was making sure nobody could dismiss the truth as emotion. Monday afternoon, another unexpected message arrived. It came from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years. "Can we meet? I think I owe you an apology." We met at a quiet coffee shop outside downtown Billings. He looked nervous before I even sat down. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Last Christmas, your parents asked several of us to stop lending you money." I stared at him. I've never asked any relative for money. "I know that now." He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "They said you kept borrowing small amounts and forgetting about them because of your mental health. They told us giving you cash would only make things worse." Suddenly, dozens of strange memories made sense. Birthday cards with no checks inside, relatives politely refusing when I offered to split restaurant bills because they insisted I should save my money. An uncle once trying to slip me grocery vouchers instead of accepting repayment after I accidentally left my wallet in another town during a fishing trip. I had interpreted those moments as simple kindness. Now, I understood they had been responding to stories I never knew existed. My cousin pulled out his phone and showed me old messages from my mother warning family members not to trust me with financial decisions. "I saved them because I thought they were important," he admitted. "Now, I think they're important for a different reason." Before we left, he forwarded every screenshot to me. Walking back to my truck, I realized something had quietly changed. For the first time, people weren't asking me to defend myself. They were bringing me evidence on their own. The lies had become too large to stay perfectly aligned. Small cracks were appearing everywhere, and once people compared notes, the picture looked completely different. That evening, I opened the large family group chat that had remained almost silent since the podcast aired. More than 40 relatives were still members. I typed a short message, attached nothing, and erased it 3 different times before closing the app. I wasn't ready yet. One careless sentence could turn everything into another emotional family argument. If I spoke, every word had to be supported. Every file had to be in order. Every date had to match. While reviewing my folders one final time before bed, I noticed a detail I had somehow overlooked. Several church fundraising emails had been sent during months when my bank records showed I had been making extra mortgage payments ahead of schedule. My parents had been telling people I couldn't afford groceries at the exact same time I was quietly paying down my own home loan. That contradiction wasn't just embarrassing for them anymore. It connected money, dates, and documented public claims in a way that could force a lot more people to start asking questions. For the next several days, I resisted every urge to post something online. Friends kept telling me to defend myself immediately. A few coworkers suggested making a video response. One even offered to help me edit it. I thanked them all and declined. My parents had spent years building their version of my life one conversation at a time. I wasn't going to answer with anger. I wanted something much harder to dismiss. I wanted a record that anyone could verify for themselves. I took 2 vacation days from work and turned my dining room into what looked more like a case file than a home office. Every document went into chronological order. Mortgage payments were matched with bank statements. Employment records were matched with tax documents and payroll deposits. Company emails announcing my promotion were placed beside the dates when my parents had been telling church members I was supposedly unable to keep a job. Utility bills showed that I had been living independently while relatives were still being told I slept in my childhood bedroom. Every page supported another page. Every fact had a second fact standing beside it. Midway through the second afternoon, the podcast producer called again. This time, he sounded exhausted. "Mr. Collins, I can't discuss every detail while the review is active," he said, "but I believe you should know that we've removed the episode from all official platforms." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Thank you." "That doesn't erase the copies already circulating," he admitted. "No." "We've also discovered that the consent confirmation submitted before recording contains information we can no longer verify. Our legal department is reviewing the matter internally." He paused before continuing. "Several staff members have expressed concern that basic verification procedures were bypassed because your parents appeared trustworthy." After we ended the call, I didn't celebrate. Removing one episode couldn't undo thousands of downloads or conversations. But it meant something important. For the first time, an organization outside my family had looked at the facts instead of their performance. That evening, another message arrived, this time from the chair of the church council. He wrote politely, asking whether I would be willing to meet privately. I almost refused. Churches had always been my mother's strongest audience. Then I realized that refusing would only leave her version unchallenged. We met 2 days later in a small conference room beside the sanctuary where I had grown up. 3 council members were present. They treated me with quiet respect from the moment I arrived. The chairman spoke first. "Mr. Collins, we're conducting a review regarding charitable collections organized in your name over several years." He placed several folders on the table. "We would like to compare our records with yours." For nearly 3 hours, we reviewed dates, announcements, event calendars, and donation summaries. Nobody accused anyone. Nobody argued. They simply compared documents. Every time one of their records claimed I was unemployed, I produced payroll records showing I had been working full-time. Every time they showed fundraising notices requesting grocery assistance, I matched them with mortgage payments, utility bills, and insurance statements proving I had been maintaining my own household. One elderly council member removed his glasses and quietly rubbed his forehead. "These timelines," he murmured, "they don't fit together." "No," I answered calmly. "They never did." Before leaving, I signed a written statement confirming which documents belonged to me and authorized them to keep copies. As I walked toward the parking lot, the chairman caught up with me. "There is one thing you should prepare for," he said gently. "If our review reaches the conclusions I think it may reach, your parents will almost certainly blame you for everything that follows." I looked at him for several seconds. "They've been doing that my entire life." He nodded sadly. I suspected as much. 3 days later, the moment I had been preparing for finally arrived. I opened the family group chat with 43 relatives still inside. Instead of writing a long emotional message, I uploaded a carefully organized PDF containing a chronological timeline followed by labeled folders of supporting documents. The first page contained only verified dates: my move to Billings, mortgage closing documents, employment history, promotion announcement, tax records. The second section compared those facts with public statements my parents had made during the same periods. The third included screenshots of church announcements, text messages, and the podcast transcript. I ended the file with a single paragraph. I am not asking anyone to choose sides. I am asking only that you compare dates, documents, and recorded statements before deciding what is true. Then I put my phone face down and walked outside. I spent nearly an hour mowing the lawn because I couldn't bear to watch the reactions appear in real time. When I finally returned, the group chat had exploded. More than 600 unread messages waited for me. Some relatives apologized immediately. Others admitted they had heard completely different stories over the years and had never realized the contradictions. Several began comparing their own conversations with my parents. One aunt uploaded old emails my mother had sent her. An uncle shared handwritten notes from family meetings where my father had claimed I was financially dependent on them. Another cousin posted screenshots showing that my parents had told him I was living in another state during the exact period they were telling someone else I refused to leave home. The discussion no longer revolved around me. It revolved around the growing number of inconsistencies that only became visible once everyone placed their information together. My parents entered the chat nearly 2 hours later. My mother's first message was only 4 words long. Don't believe his manipulation. My father followed with a much longer response accusing me of attacking the family because I couldn't handle constructive criticism. Neither of them addressed a single document. Neither explained the conflicting timelines. Neither denied using my name on the podcast. They simply demanded that everyone stop reading what I had posted. Then Liam joined. Instead of defending the evidence, he accused me of trying to ruin his future. That sentence caught everyone's attention. My aunt immediately asked what he meant. Liam didn't answer. Another cousin reminded him that the documents showed charity collections continuing while I had been employed full-time. Someone else asked why the family had been told I lived at home if mortgage records proved otherwise. Question after question appeared faster than anyone could answer them. Watching the conversation unfold, I realized I no longer needed to convince anyone. The evidence was forcing people to ask questions my parents could no longer avoid. And before the night was over, one unexpected message appeared that threatened to change Liam's life as dramatically as the podcast had changed mine. The unexpected message did not come from Liam. It came from Hannah, the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 3 months. Until that moment, she had never written a single word in the family group chat. Most of us barely knew her because she had always stayed out of family disagreements. Her message was short. Liam, I need you to answer one question. Did you know these stories about Evan weren't true? Nobody replied for almost a minute. Then Liam typed, erased his response, and finally wrote, "It's complicated." Hannah answered immediately. "No, it's not." After that, the chat went silent again. I put my phone down and went to bed, convinced that nothing more would happen until morning. I was wrong. At 6:30 the next day, I woke up to dozens of missed calls. Not from relatives this time, but from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them all and checked my messages instead. Rachel had sent only one sentence. "Don't answer unknown numbers until we talk." 20 minutes later, she arrived at my house carrying coffee and looking more tired than I had ever seen her. "Your parents have started calling everyone," she said before sitting down. "Everyone?" "Relatives, church members, Hannah's family. They're saying your documents were edited and that you're having another breakdown." I nodded slowly. "I expected that." "There's more." She handed me her phone. Someone had recorded a voicemail my mother left for Hannah's parents. My mother's voice sounded desperate but carefully controlled. She begged them not to allow one unstable person to destroy 2 good families. Then she said something that made Rachel and me stare at each other in disbelief. Please convince Hannah to continue with the wedding. Liam shouldn't lose everything because Evan is acting this way. She wasn't asking anyone to verify the evidence. She wasn't denying the documents. She wanted people to ignore them for the sake of appearances. That afternoon, my employer called me into a meeting. I had expected the worst since the podcast first appeared. Instead, my operations director closed the office door and slid a printed copy of the family timeline across the table. "One of our clients sent this to me," he said. "I read every page." I waited without speaking. "You've handled this professionally," he continued. "You never involved the company. You never missed work. Your employment record speaks for itself." Then he smiled faintly. "Congratulations on surviving the most thoroughly documented family argument I've ever seen." We both laughed for the first time in weeks. Before I left, he added one more sentence. "If anyone contacts the company trying to damage your reputation again, direct them to our legal department." Walking back to my desk, I realized something had changed inside me. I was no longer waiting for the next attack. I was simply moving forward while other people compared facts for themselves. 2 days later, the church council informed its congregation that an internal review regarding charitable collections was underway. They didn't mention names publicly, but everyone knew who the announcement concerned. My mother called me 11 times that afternoon. My father called 6. Liam sent 23 text messages ranging from angry accusations to desperate requests. "Just delete the files. You're humiliating Mom. People are twisting everything. Please think about Dad's position." I answered none of them. Instead, I forwarded every message to the folder where I had been saving communications since the podcast aired. That evening, someone knocked on my front door. Through the window, I saw my parents' SUV parked across the street. My father stood on the porch while my mother remained inside the vehicle. I didn't open the door. He knocked again, harder this time. "Evan," he shouted, "we need to talk like adults." I remained where I was. After another minute, he tried a different approach. "We're willing to forgive everything if you take those documents down." "Forgive me." I almost laughed. The only thing separating us was a locked door and years of lies that could no longer survive daylight. Eventually, he slipped an envelope through the mail slot before walking away. I waited until their vehicle disappeared before picking it up. Inside was a handwritten letter signed by both of my parents. It wasn't an apology. It was a proposal. They promised to tell people the podcast had been exaggerated if I publicly admitted I had misunderstood their intentions. They wanted us to release a joint statement saying the family had simply experienced communication problems. In return, everyone could move forward together. There wasn't a single sentence acknowledging the false stories, the fake consent, the fundraising, or the damage done to my life. They still wanted one final lie to protect all the previous ones. I scanned the letter, added it to my records, and placed the original in a folder. The next morning, I instructed an attorney to prepare a formal notice demanding that my parents, Liam, and anyone acting on their behalf stop contacting me at my home, workplace, phone number, and email. I wasn't filing a dramatic lawsuit. I wasn't asking for revenge. I simply wanted a clear legal boundary after months of escalating harassment. Copies were sent by certified mail. The same afternoon, I changed my phone number, updated emergency contacts at work, installed a video doorbell, and informed my neighbors that certain relatives were no longer welcome on the property. 3 days later, Hannah called Rachel instead of me. Rachel put the conversation on speaker after asking whether that was all right. Hannah sounded heartbroken but calm. "I've ended the engagement," she said quietly. Nobody spoke. After a long pause, she continued. "It wasn't because of one mistake. It was because Liam admitted he always knew your parents exaggerated things about Evan. He said it kept the family together." She took a shaky breath. "If someone can live with a lie for years because it's convenient, I can't build a marriage on that." When the call ended, Rachel reached over and squeezed my hand. Neither of us celebrated. Another relationship had collapsed, but not because I exposed anyone. It collapsed because the truth finally reached someone who had been making decisions without it. A week later, my attorney called with confirmation that all 3 certified letters had been delivered. By then, the calls had stopped completely. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. For the first time in years, nobody was trying to tell me who I was. Only one step remained before I could finally close that chapter of my life forever. The last step turned out to be much quieter than everything that came before it. There was no dramatic courtroom speech, no public confrontation, and no moment where my parents suddenly admitted everything they had done. Real life almost never works that way. Instead, the truth spread slowly because documents kept saying the same thing no matter who looked at them. A few weeks after my attorney sent the formal notices, the podcast company informed me that its internal review had been completed. They confirmed that the episode would not be restored, updated their internal consent procedures, and issued a written apology directly to me for broadcasting false personal claims without my authorization. They did not erase what had happened, but they acknowledged it never should have happened in the first place. That mattered more than I expected. Around the same time, the church council completed its own review. I was never interested in hearing every detail because it was no longer my responsibility to manage the consequences of my parents' choices. I only learned what affected me personally. The charitable collections organized in my name were permanently discontinued. Members of the congregation who had donated over the years were privately informed that serious inconsistencies had been found between the public stories and documented facts. Several families contacted me afterward. None of them demanded explanations. Most simply apologized for believing things they had been told. I accepted every sincere apology because I understood something they finally understood too. Trust is valuable, and dishonest people almost always borrow it from honest ones. My father quietly stepped down from the youth sports program he had supervised for years after several parents questioned whether someone who had publicly misrepresented his own son should continue leading children. No public announcement blamed him by name. The complaints spoke for themselves. My mother gradually disappeared from organizing church fundraisers. People who once praised her endless dedication became much more careful before accepting emotional stories without asking basic questions. Liam moved into a small apartment by himself after Hannah ended their engagement. Months later, he sent one final email. It contained only 3 sentences. He admitted he had known the podcast would embarrass me, admitted he should have stopped it, and admitted that staying silent had been easier than confronting our parents. He never asked me to forgive him. I never answered. Some conversations arrive years too late. Rachel and I also had to decide whether our own relationship still had a future. We didn't pretend those weeks had never happened. She admitted that doubt had entered her mind because my parents had spent years preparing everyone around us to question my version of reality before I even spoke. I admitted that rebuilding trust would take time. Instead of rushing another wedding date, we chose something much simpler. We learned how to speak honestly, even when the conversations were uncomfortable. About 8 months later, we married in a small ceremony with fewer than 40 guests. There were no speeches about perfect families. There were no dramatic reconciliations. My side of the guest list was noticeably smaller than most weddings, but every person sitting there actually knew me instead of the character my parents had invented. Sometimes people ask whether I regret publishing all those documents. My answer is always the same. I didn't publish rumors. I didn't publish revenge. I published evidence after every private attempt at silence had already failed. The consequences that followed came from recorded statements, written messages, financial records, and contradictions that existed long before I collected them into one place. The truth didn't become powerful because I made it louder. It became powerful because it stayed consistent while every lie required another lie to survive. I still live in the same house in Billings. The mortgage is almost halfway paid now. My promotion eventually led to another one, and these days I supervise a larger logistics team than I ever imagined I would. Most evenings are wonderfully ordinary. I mow the lawn, fix little things around the house, cook dinner with Rachel, and enjoy a life that no longer depends on anyone else's approval. Every now and then, someone recognizes my name from the old podcast story. Usually they hesitate before mentioning it. When that happens, I simply smile and tell them the complete story eventually found its way into the light. That's enough. I no longer feel the need to convince strangers who I am. The people who truly matter have already seen the evidence and reached their own conclusions. Looking back, I realize the biggest victory had nothing to do with damaged reputations, canceled weddings, removed podcast episodes, or internal investigations. Those were only consequences. The real victory came the first morning I woke up without checking my phone to see what new story my family had invented about me. For most of my life, I believed freedom meant proving them wrong. I was mistaken. Freedom began the moment I stopped living inside the version of me they created for everyone else. I cannot control what people choose to say after I leave a room. None of us can. But I can control whether I help keep a lie alive. I chose not to. That decision cost me my parents, my brother, and the illusion that we were ever the family I wanted us to be. It also gave me something I had never truly owned before, a quiet life built on facts instead of fear. If someone listening to my story is trapped inside a family where the truth keeps changing depending on the audience, remember this: you don't need the loudest voice. You need the clearest record. Lies usually become more complicated over time because they must constantly adapt. The truth rarely needs that kind of maintenance. It simply waits for someone willing to place the facts in the right order. That was all I finally did. Once the facts began speaking for themselves, I didn't have to fight anymore.